What do you believe happens when we die? Now, while there's not one singularly held belief system among all neopagans, there are some common beliefs and threads that make their way through most traditions of modern paganism, witchcraft, and Wicca. And we are going to be talking about some of these most common belief systems in tonight's episode. So, merry meet. I'm Aislin. This is Ask Aislin, and I am here tonight talking about neopaganism and the afterlife. So, welcome to everyone who is joining me. If you are here with me live, you can leave a thumbs up or a heart at any point, and that will help us get this to the feed of other people. Also, if you're watching back in replay. And if you have any questions or any comments and you're here live, leave these in the chat and we'll have a Q&A at the end. If you're watching back on YouTube later, make sure to subscribe to Body Mind Witchcraft so you don't miss any of our future episodes. All right, so we are going to dive right in and just saying hello to those who are joining us. So we're going to start by talking about some of the world belief systems and what they believe about death and the afterlife. And so we're going to be talking about ancient Egypt, we're going to talk about ancient Greece, as well as the ancient and Jewish and Christian texts. We'll also be looking at Hinduism and Buddhism as well. And then we'll look at how those belief systems lend themselves to us as neopagans, witches, Wiccans, um, and the like. Okay, so welcome. Hi, Melinda. I see Melinda's here in the chat. Again, if you're here live, you can leave any comments, questions. If you're here watching it in replay as well, you can leave the questions and comments. I'll go back and answer them later. All right, so I'm going to dive right in, and we are going to start with ancient Egypt. Okay, so most world religions have some kind of a view on the afterlife. So some will have a more definitive view where it's very strict and it's very spelled out very clearly, and other systems kind of leave it up for the practitioner. So it's always useful for us to look back at past civilizations and the belief systems of other areas of the world, as well as in history. All right, so ancient Egyptians believed that one could live happily in an afterlife if they were virtuous, if they worshiped the gods, if they had a proper funeral, and that is a very important aspect. Upon death, it was believed that the soul would meet Osiris, who would then determine whether it was worthy of going on to live in an eternal life that was very much similar to the waking life, to the life of the living. Now, what's very interesting is that in some areas of ancient Egypt, it was actually believed that the living played a large role in what would happen to you after death. So, for example, if someone didn't like you after you died, and they believed that if they decapitated you or cut off your head, this was like having a second death, and a second death would prevent your access into the afterlife. So it's very important in ancient Egypt that you had it set up so that something like this would not happen. You didn't have enemies that could basically prevent you from moving into the afterlife. Now, in ancient Greece, there are various ideas about the soul. Just like in Egypt, what I'm saying here, what may not have been believed across all of ancient Egypt and across all time periods, but at least this was a belief system at some point. Now, in ancient Greece, there were various beliefs about the soul, kind of depending on what part of ancient Greek history you're looking at. Homer, for anybody who has read the Odyssey, there's a whole section when he goes into the afterlife, him and his men go into the afterlife or the other world. And it's a shadowy place. The soul exists in kind of this shadowy, murky place after death. It's not very pleasant if you've read that part of the book. Dark and dreary kind of underworld. So the ancient Greeks didn't really have a totally positive view of the underworld. But several centuries later, when Plato was writing, he talked about a soul that was very intelligent and it was very aware, and it could move from this life into death and still continue to live in some way. The soul was eternal. Now, his own student Aristotle said that the soul was all the life systems that make up life, that make up the human when they are alive. And so we see in ancient Greece, there was actually this belief about the soul. Now, ancient Jewish and Christian texts show us various different things. There's a little bit of disagreement, and there's not really one commonly held belief if you're actually looking at the texts. Now, in the Old Testament, it indicates that there is a belief in a future resurrection for those who have died. So it's not necessarily this die and go right to heaven that we see in modern Christian belief systems. Now, most Christians believe that there is an eternity for the righteous, for those who have lived a good life and knew Jesus. The New Testament actually suggests that the dead will be asleep upon death until there is a resurrection at the second coming of Christ. So, what's very interesting about that is that the Bible itself doesn't actually dictate or notate these beliefs that modern Christians have of this kind of immediate ascension into either heaven or hell, or if you're Catholic, the purgatory in between. In fact, there was this idea that you would basically be in this kind of sleep-like state until that resurrection happened. Now, most Christian theology, though, of today, the modern theology, merges non-biblical ideas about the afterlife with the biblical promise of resurrection. So, like the Jewish text, however, it's a bit vague. The Bible is also vague about what exactly happens after death. Jewish text as well, a bit vague. So, what that means is that it opens it up for the practitioner to kind of decide what are their viewpoints about life and death. Now, Hinduism and Buddhism are especially important to talk about when we're talking about neo-pagan views of the afterlife, because a lot of what neo-pagans believe seems to come from those concepts, that comes from more Eastern concepts. And just saying hi to those who are joining us. Hi, Lynn. In Hinduism, there is a belief in an eternal soul. It is called Atman. It is essentially the true self. It's eternal. It's invisible. It's basically a devout Hindu's belief is that the self is actually an illusion. So the self that we see in this world is actually an illusion. It's a false self. Now, we might say in the West, we might say that's ego. And for those of you who study shadow work or do shadow work, you'll know that one of the main ideas about shadow work is to try to determine where is the ego and where is the true self, the higher self. Now, upon death, the Atman basically discards the physical body and awaits a new one. So there's this concept of reincarnation that we're going to talk about because it's a very common thread in neopaganism. And there's also a belief in Hinduism that all things have souls. That includes plants and minerals. So you could see why neopagans, witches, and Wiccans would be adopting viewpoints like this, because it brings into this realm this idea of a soul inside of everything. Now, in Buddhism, there isn't really this belief in that eternal Atman or that eternal soul that is kind of unique to all people. There is no constant soul per se, but there is this idea of a life after death. So one analogy that's actually quite good here is think about a river. And if you were to take a cup of water out of a river, or you could think of the ocean, any body of water, and you took a cup of water out of that body of water and you kind of held it in your hand, that would be like your life. Okay, it's contained, that bit of the soul of the universe is contained within that cup. But upon death, that cup is poured out into the body of water, and while it still exists, it merges with all of the other molecules inside that body of water. So it's a very good analogy in that there isn't really this soul that everyone possesses in Buddhism. Now, what also determines what happens after death, when that water is dropped back in and then a new cup of water is brought out, is the karma that will influence the new soul, depending on what kind of life they lived before. So there's that idea of karma. But there is no constant soul in Buddhism the way we see it in Hinduism and most of the other world religions. So that brings us to neopaganism, modern witchcraft, Wicca, and other pagan religions. So, what do people believe who are pagan? So, many adopt a theory for the soul that merges Eastern and Western concepts. And so, what this means is there's more than one part of the body generally. It's not just one soul. So, kind of if you think about Christianity, there's just sort of this one soul that when we die, it goes to heaven or to hell or to purgatory. But in most neo pagan religions or traditions, we believe in a physical body, an etheric body, which is basically where the life force is, an astral body, which is essentially a layer of mental consciousness. This would be emotions and thoughts that are fleeting, and also a higher self, so a true self, or some might even say spirit, or this might be what we call the eternal soul traditionally. Now, the physical and the etheric body are tied together. Sometimes this is called the lower complex. It doesn't mean anything's lesser. It just simply means it's closer to be to this earth, to this plane that we're in. And these two are tied together as long as the being is alive. So if you think about a sponge and you soak up water into this sponge, so you could kind of think of the sponge as being the physical body. You could think of the water that's inside of it as being the etheric body. So as long as that water is inside the sponge, the being is alive. Upon death, it's like a dried up sponge, and the water evaporates and goes off, and that leaves behind just the physical body. Now, what's interesting about the etheric body is that it actually can leave, parts of it can leave the physical body without the body actually dying. So, one thought to think about, and there's no scientific way to prove this, but it's a belief that's held by some people, is that when your foot falls asleep, for example, that tingling that comes back when basically you kind of shift, and that little tingling you feel is essentially the etheric body. Part of it had detached out of the physical body, and now it's returning, and you have that little tingling feeling. Anybody who has done any kind of had any out of body experiences knows that there is something that leaves, right? They're able to look down, and so that would be a theory too, that it's the etheric body that is detaching itself from the physical. Some of it's still remaining though, so the person or the being is still alive. Now, there is also a connection between the astral body, that's where all of like the emotions and the thoughts are, that's the very fleeting part, and the higher self. Those are also very much connected. And this is why it can be very hard for people to access the higher self, because the thoughts and the emotions of this physical plane get in the way. So that's why shadow work is so important, because we work through those things that allows us to get closer to the higher self. So let's talk about neo-pagan perspectives of the afterlife. So what do many witches, Wiccans, and other neo-pagans believe happens when we die? So there is no definitive book. There's no Bible for neo-pagans. There are not a lot of religious texts. There is one text called The Charge of the Goddess that people usually consider to be a pretty reverent piece of literature. They believe it was channeled from the goddess to Doreen Valiente, some say. Some say the source goes much further back than her. I think if it truly came from her, it would have been written in about the 40s or 50s. I might have that date wrong, but it's going to be right around there. Now, in The Charge of the Goddess, which is a very beautiful poem, it's often recited at a person's funeral, though it can also be recited at other times, like during drawing down the moon. Many people will recite it at the full moon when they draw down the moon into their bodies. There is a line in this piece of literature that says, "I give knowledge of the spirit eternal, and beyond death I give peace, freedom, and reunion with those who have gone before." And so this says, from this perspective, that a neo-pagan who subscribes to that piece of literature would believe in an eternal soul after death. Now, like I mentioned, there's no singularly held belief, but what generally happens is the question, like for everybody, the question is ultimately up to you what happens when we die. But we don't have an original sin as they do in Christianity. And so there isn't really this idea that the world is tainted. And so that's kind of interesting as well. Because in many religions, there's this idea that there's some kind of tainted aspect to being incarnated here in this plane, and we have to do good things. We have to aspire to leave this world so that we would go to a better one. But the thing about pagan religions, neo-pagan religions, is there isn't that belief of original sin. And so there's no need for salvation and there's no need to be saved from anything. And we believe that we are already spirit and we always will be spirit. There's nothing to be saved from. And so some neo-pagans, because of that, they just simply choose to not preoccupy themselves with thoughts about what happens after we die. But for other people, for those who do contemplate this, there seems to be two major categories that neo-pagan beliefs about the afterlife fall into. One of them is reincarnation, and the second one is the Summerlands. And then I'm going to talk about both of those, and I will let you know that the majority of neo-pagans that I know, or many, I should say, they believe in a combination of those two ideas together. And you'll see that they work very well together. So let's talk about reincarnation for a moment. It's a bit different than the reincarnation that we might see in some of the Eastern religions. And so there always is this question, where did this idea come from? How did it enter neo-pagan belief systems? So we're not entirely sure, but some people think it goes back to Gerald Gardner. Gerald Gardner, like many people around the same time as him who were writing about modern witchcraft, took trips to the East. Gerald Gardner spent a period of time in Southeast Asia, and there he was influenced by Eastern religions. So it's possible that some of our ideas about reincarnation in neo-paganism come from his writings. Another possibility that goes back further than him, that would go back to like about the turn of the century, a little bit after that, is Robert Graves, who wrote a book called The White Goddess, and James Frazer, who wrote a book called The Golden Bough. The Golden Bough was written in like 1897, and I can't remember the date of The White Goddess, but both books assert, especially The Golden Bough, asserts this idea of a dying and a resurrected god or goddess. And so what James Frazer did is it's very interesting. It's an interesting book to read. I think I've talked about it before in a previous episode. It's very dry and it's very long, and the print is very small on the pages. But for those who are really interested in like historical, like kind of the historical roots of neo-paganism, it's a book that I highly recommend. Many of our modern authors actually either have read that book or they've been influenced by people who did. And so we see the ideas from the Golden Bough actually in a lot of our modern books on witchcraft, Wicca, and paganism. So in this book, there is this idea. So basically what James Frazer did, he never actually traveled to any of the places, from what I remember, in the book. He may have traveled to a few of them, but most of these places he did not travel to. He instead wrote letters of correspondence to people who lived in various populations around the world, and he asked questions about what they believed, and he was able to kind of also look at the history and the archaeology of different regions to try to piece together what ancient religions believed about death and dying. And what he saw across many, many, many ancient cultures is this idea of this dying and this resurrected God. Now, we see this idea of reincarnation, therefore, in a lot of religions. So we see it in Buddhism, we see it in Hinduism, Shintoism, Taoism. So anybody who was studying at that time in the East would have been influenced by it. It's really thought of as being probably more of an evolutionary process that the soul goes through, where the lessons that are learned kind of lead us to enlightenment. So it's very much possible that these ideas that these authors came across when they were traveling to the East sort of got coupled with that idea of the dying, that resurrected God, and the idea of the cycles of the seasons, which obviously modern pagans could just look and see, could just see in nature around them. It's possible that all of those things together led to this idea in neopaganism of resurrection. Now, the form of, not resurrection, of reincarnation. Now, the form of reincarnation in neopaganism is a bit different than in other religions. It's not like I mentioned before, neopagans never really believe that that life is this prison that we have to escape from. So the reincarnation found in neopaganism, witchcraft, Wicca, is often viewed as a process of growth and learning. And so the lessons that are learned in one life or not learned in one life translate into the next life. And so this is a good time to talk a bit about karma, because I personally think that sometimes I see people who have some interesting views about karma that I don't necessarily agree with. And so there's this idea in karma that, you do good things and good things happen, and you do bad things and bad things happen. And I don't know that it's necessarily exactly that way. And so like sometimes people will say, there's a string of bad things happening, or hardship or trouble in their life, and they'll say, what must I have done in the past life to have deserved this? And honestly, the idea of reincarnation and karma in neopaganism, it doesn't really lend itself to that view. It's more karma, what we might call good karma, are the lessons that we achieved in a past life. And the things that we might call bad karma are the lessons that we just simply didn't achieve. So in this life, things that seem like they're bad karma or patterns or things that we seem to be repeated over and over in our lives are just simply a lesson that we're supposed to be learning in this life. So we can either learn it here and take it into the next life or the next life. Sometimes there are lessons that actually take multiple lives to learn. And so in our Shadow Seekers group last month, we did a whole module on past life regression and past lives, and we talked a lot about that idea that sometimes when we actually regress ourselves into our past lives, we actually see that there are things that happen in the past lives that are happening in our current life. And that doesn't mean that we're a failure. It doesn't mean that we've done something wrong. It just sometimes means it's a lesson that was big enough and important enough that it needs more than one life to learn. So it's a different kind of way of looking at karma. And in that way, we don't have to blame ourselves or wonder what bad things we might have done. We just simply need to look at our lives, see what's going on, see where the patterns are, see where the hardships are, and figure out what the lesson could be that we're trying to learn. So so that kind of segues into the Summerlands. So this is a different idea about what happens after we die. This is also adopted by many neopagans, witches, and Wiccans. So the idea of reincarnation, if we kind of look at it in some of the European areas, it didn't necessarily exist there. So it's kind of interesting, like in Celtic and Euro-pagan traditions, in the Egyptian tradition, we don't see this idea of reincarnation. Now, Julius Caesar, he wrote that the Celtic Druids believed in a transmigration of souls. This would suggest reincarnation. It suggests that the Celts believed in reincarnation. There's really not a lot of evidence that supports that idea, though. Archaeologically, it seems like the Celts believed in a world, another world that existed after death, similar to other ancient pagans of that area. Like the Greeks believed in the river Styx, that a person would travel across when they died, and it could either lead to a good life or a bad life. What we talked about, the very, very ancient Greeks had the kind of that dark and dreary kind of view of the afterlife. The more modern ancient Greeks, talking more about the time of probably Plato and Aristotle, had this idea of Hades as a place to go that would be kind of like a hellish kind of place, or Elysium, which was a place that was more like heaven. So we don't see reincarnation with the ancient Greeks. The Norse believed in an afterlife in Valhalla, and the Celts seem to have believed in an afterlife called Tirnanog, at least some parts of the Celtic ancient Celts. Now, some Celts, though, believed in a place called the Summerlands, and so this is where this idea enters in neopaganism. The Summerlands is thought to be a resting place, where it's forever summer, and the body is restored to its youthful state, where it's the most healthy and the strongest. Now, many neo-pagan beliefs accept this belief. So if you actually read some books on the afterlife, neo-paganism and the afterlife, there is a good one by Starhawk that's called I think it's called the Pagan Book of Death and Dying. It's a very good one. Um, and talks a bit about the Summerlands in there. I know that Scott Cunningham talks about it in some of his books. Christopher Penczak talks about it in some of his. So many neo-pagan traditions believe in this idea of the Summerlands. Now, some feel it's like a rest stop between lives. So if you believe in reincarnation, there would be a place to go between the lives. When you die and you pass through the veils and you're kind of there and trying to figure out where and when you're going to reincarnate, it would stop in the Summerlands and you go on to the next life when you are ready to reincarnate. Now, others view the idea of the Summerlands as kind of like a one stop, like a heaven kind of viewpoint. It isn't really, there isn't really any agreement. There's who knows what's right or what's wrong, right? Some feel that the Summerlands could be a place, whether they call it that or not, could be a place which is the world of the gods and the goddesses. So where we would be united with the divine. Some feel it might be a transition into another dimension in the universe, even. So, there's no definitive theory, like I mentioned in the beginning. Ultimately, it's really up to you to decide what you believe as a modern pagan. So I will personally share, and anybody who's here live or watches this later in the replay, I love to hear about other people's views. So, feel free to share in the comments. What do you think happens when we die as a neo-pagan? What are your views on it? So I personally feel that I believe in reincarnation. I believe very much in past lives. I've accessed some of my own and I've helped other people access theirs. So I believe that. I also like this idea of the Summerlands. I don't necessarily believe that as soon as we pass through the veils, that we immediately reincarnate into the next life. I think we might spend time on the other side and probably view what happened in the previous incarnation and kind of make some decisions about what we'll do next. Some probably incarnate faster than others and some kind of wait. So, but again, it's ultimately up to you what you think happens. All right, so I am going to, we're going to move into the Q&A now. And I have some questions that were sent to me. Anybody who's here live, you can put some questions or comments in the chat. I'd love to hear from you. And I also, while you're kind of putting questions in, I'm also going to let you know what's coming up. But let me start first with some of the questions that were sent to me, okay? So I'm going to start with a question from Quentin. So he said, what is a good starting assortment of crystals to have? So I think this is actually a really great question because we often talk about what crystals are good for what things, but what would you do if you were trying to if you just wanted to buy so that you kind of had the right ones or enough of the right ones that could kind of be associated with any intention that you have. So this would be my advice on it. I would go and I would get a crystal, one or two for each of the chakras. So you just get one to start. And that way you'll know that you have kind of all of your bases covered because the chakra system itself covers almost every intention that we could think about. So I would get, for the root chakra, I would get bloodstone or garnet. Those are my two favorites, but any stone that is a deep, deep red or like a black color, like black tourmaline is a very good one for the root chakra. So you could get that. For the for the sacral chakra, hands down for me, it's carnelian, but any stone that is orange in color would work for the sacral chakra. For the solar plexus, I love citrine or yellow calcite, but any stone that's yellow. For the heart, you can get any stone that's green. I personally really love serpentine, aventurine. I know a lot of people love jade for it, but there's also, pink is also connected to the heart chakra. So quartz, rose quartz is another very good one, or like rhodonite or rhodochrosite, which is a little bit more expensive than rhodonite. For the throat chakra, lapis lazuli, very good. I love blue kyanite as well. I really love lapis. I like to wear my lapis heart when I'm talking in front of people because I think it's very good for communication. For the third eye, generally stones that are a very, very dark blue or kind of a light purple are very good. So I think purple fluorite is really great for the third eye. Amethyst is another very good one. And then for the crown, quartz. Just a regular quartz would be very good. And so in addition, so I'd get 7 stones, one for each of the chakras, and you have kind of all those bases covered. And then I would get a stone for protection. So I would have some kind of a black stone like onyx or obsidian or black tourmaline, which would also connect to the root chakra. And then I would get a piece of selenite. And so there you could get nine stones or so. And I feel like that would be a great starting point for somebody who's collecting crystals and didn't know what to get. All right, so I hope that helps. And if anybody has other questions about stones, you can ask about those as well. Okay, so next I have a question from Krista, and she is trying to learn the Rider-Waite deck, just like her mother's. And she said that she wrote down all of the meanings of the cards, but she couldn't find anything about the cards that were upside down. And so she said, are they like the Norse runes, where if reversed, they mean the opposite? Okay, so I already kind of answered this question where she left it. I believe that, she's using the Rider-Waite. So if you're using the Rider-Waite deck, there is a set of reversals for that for sure. So if your deck doesn't have the book that comes with it, you can Google online. I personally like Biddy Tarot. I think she has some pretty good descriptions, and she uses the Rider-Waite. But if you just Google Rider-Waite reversals, you'll actually you might even find the book, like a copy of the book, the little tiny pamphlet that comes with a deck, and you would get all the reversals that way. I do have some thoughts on reversals. So she asked if they were like the Norse runes, where the reversals are just simply the opposite. And in some cases, yes, and in some, no. Some of the reversals don't really look like they're just simply the opposites, but many do. I think there's a couple of interesting ways to think about reversals as well. So it kind of depends on the reader. So some people they very much read the reversals. Other people don't read them at all. They just simply just don't read them. It kind of depends on the reading for me, whether I'll choose to read them or not. There is one thought that if the majority of the cards in a spread are reversed, that you turn all of them over. So that would mean that anything that was upright would now be reversed, and anything that was reversed is now upright. And what that would do is it would mean that at any time, the majority of the cards should be upright. So that's one way to think about it. Another way is to not read the reversals, or rather read them in kind of a slightly different way. So one thing that I like to do with reversals is to think about that energy of that card and where I am at with it. So sometimes what a reversal can be is the energy isn't quite here yet. It's coming in, or it's just passing out, but it's not actually present in the moment. And so that's what some readers do, is they read reversals as though the energy isn't actually there. It's either coming or going. So that's one way to think of it. Another way to think about reversals is not necessarily that they're just the opposite of whatever the card means, but that it's like an exclamation point. Like, pay attention to that card because there's something more important about that reversed card than the other cards around it. So just a few of my thoughts I wanted to share, but if you're specifically looking for the Rider-Waite deck, or looking at the Rider-Waite deck and studying, I would just try to find the book that goes with it. I have the Rider-Waite deck is actually here. I'm not even sure the book's in here. Yeah, so there's this little book that comes with them. I bet you'd be able to find a copy of this online, and it has all of your reversals for you. And then if you want, you can write those down wherever you have the meanings for the upright cards. Okay, so I think I'm going to segue into another question that got asked about tarot. And so Jennifer asked if there was a good starter deck of tarot cards that I recommend. All right, so the Rider-Waite, again, very good deck. If you have never used the Rider-Waite, then this is a good place to start. I believe this was probably the first deck I ever got. It's probably the first deck that many people got. It What's so good about it is that you got to kind of learn with the traditional symbols of tarot. You can get variations of this though. So you can, if you don't want just this traditional Rider Waite, the Universal Tarot has kind of a similar feel to it, though it's a bit different. And then there is also just variations of the Rider Waite. So I've seen it where they use animals or they use like more modern characters than the old characters of the older deck. So you could look for a deck that is Rider Waite inspired, and then it might have different artwork, but it's going to have kind of the same symbols and the same meanings of the cards, and then that gives you a good basis. Now, there are versions of the Rider Waite, and I can't remember the actual name of it, but there is several versions where they actually have some of the very amended meanings or the shortened meanings on the cards themselves. And they'll also even have the astrological symbols, the planets, things that go with that particular card. So you might want to find a deck that actually has the meanings on it. Those are good training decks for people who are first starting out, because then they don't have to look up in the book. You simply lay your cards out. It kind of has the meanings right there for you. And over time, you'll start to learn them, and eventually you can get a deck that doesn't have the meanings on it already. Now, besides a Rider Waite deck that has the meanings on it, a deck that I really love a lot is called the Wandering Star Tarot. This deck is by Kat Pierce. I don't know when it came out, probably within the last couple of years. Very nice deck. It's not really modeled after Rider Waite, though kind of is. But what I love about it is on each card, there's like 3 or 4 key words that are sort of built into the picture. So unlike a deck like that I was talking about, where they would put like all the meanings and everything on it, this isn't. They're very subtle. So the words are kind of just built into the card itself. So I really love this deck for somebody who's new, for that very reason. Now, and then I was just going to share a few decks. At the end of the day, I think, if you don't want to go with a really traditional deck like Rider Waite or the Universal Tarot, I would just try to find a deck that you're drawn to. So if you like cats, for example, there's a lot of cat decks. The Grimalkin's Cat, Curious Cats Tarot came out last year or earlier this year. This is a great deck. Love it for the cat lovers out there. This one is by MJ Cullinane. So that's a great one for cat lovers. I mean, there's just so many decks. If you like the Game of Thrones, there's a Game of Thrones deck. This is actually a really great deck, a good one for fans of the show and the books. And there's Lord of the Rings. There's all the Golden Girls. My friend has a Golden Girls tarot deck. So, if you're just really drawn to something, I would go into a place and kind of look at decks and just see which one you're most drawn to. But that would be my recommendation. One other deck that I really love a lot is the Tarot of Curious Creatures. This is by Chris Ann. This one came out within the last couple of years. I love this deck. Not everybody likes it. My boyfriend doesn't really like the art on it, but every single card, it kind of has it has mostly the traditional meanings of the cards, but each one has a different animal, and then there's sort of advice of how to embody that animal's energy, and I really, really love the descriptions of the cards in this deck. So again, if you want to go with something traditional, you'd go with Rider Waite, but you just let yourself be drawn to whatever you're drawn to. Okay, and then I have one more question here that was left for me, and then if anybody has any in the comments, let me know. So Tanessa asked, is there a reason why this time of year makes you feel into your feelings? So it is true that this time of the year can be emotional for people. So we are moving, into the furthest parts of the dying part of the year. And so if you think about it, this is like coming into the end of the cycle, right? Once we pass through Samhain, which is for us is just a week or so from now. The astrological Samhain is on November 7th of this year, I believe, and then the traditionally celebrated day is the 31st to the 1st. Once we pass through Samhain, we go into the final 6 weeks of the cycle until we reach the solstice, the winter solstice, which marks the beginning of the growing part of the year. So you got to think about it. This part of the wheel of the year is like, it's like almost like the balsamic phase of the lunar cycle. So we know that when we get to the end of the lunar cycle, we get more emotional. Just like those who bleed sometimes get more emotional near the period when they're starting to like let go of energy, right? So this is a time in the wheel when we are also, the veils are very thin, right? So we're more susceptible to energies around us, whether they're coming from those who've departed or just people around us. We're just more receptive to energy. So some of that, those feelings that we might start picking up, maybe they're not even coming from us, but it is a very, very natural time of the year to be feeling more emotional. So what it encourages us to do is to turn inward, to reflect on what are we going to do through the winter when we kind of go and we start to do that more internal work. What are we going to do? So great time for shadow work. This is why Samhain, great time for shadow work. The dark parts of the year are a great time for doing your internal work. But just know the feelings that come up, feeling more emotional, very natural, very normal. And it's a good time to lean into, self-care if those feelings start to get too amplified. Do good things for yourself, make sure you're doing that, but also take advantage of some of this energy because it's a great time to do that internal work. Okay, so I'm looking in here in the comments. I'm going to see if there's any more questions here. So I see Tanessa asked about learning runes and what are my thoughts on runes. So I'm not a rune expert at all, so I really can't speak to that. I think that runes are, I have a few decks. I really love the witches' runes too. I've started getting into those. That's different than the Norse runes. I like the witches' runes because they symbolically, it's it's very easy to kind of interpret their meaning because they are, like, for example, one is like a sun, there's one that's a wave, so it's kind of easier to interpret those meanings. But I think runes, like any other, in the Norse runes, like any other type of divination, it's up to the practitioner which type they like the most. But I can't really, my thoughts are if you're drawn to runes, I would definitely study runes, and I think I would get a book, or I would try to probably find a video or purchase a course on it so you can learn it really well. But I think it's a great form of divination for sure. And as we move into this dark part of the year, further into, as the veils thin further and further, now is the great time to explore divination. So it's a great time to pick up a set of runes and start to study them because you're going to be more receptive to the energy and to kind of getting the messages through them. All right, so if anybody else has any other questions, leave them there in the chat. I'm going to tell you what's coming up next. We have next week on 11/1 is next Wednesday. I'm going to be doing an episode on Samhain. So I'm going to tell you about ways to celebrate Samhain. I'll tell you a little bit about where Samhain comes from and different practices and beliefs about it. And then our Coven of Midnight's Flame, Body, Mind, Witchcraft Samhain ritual is going to be on Saturday, November 4th. So we are doing a ritual with Hecate at the crossroads. So it is not exactly the same ritual we did last year. We're going to the crossroads for a different reason, but we are going to take a journey to the crossroads. And then also during that ritual, we're going to have a space where we're going to do the tolling of the bells. So if you've never done the tolling of the bells, it's a very moving ceremony where people will call out the names of those who crossed over from last Samhain to this Samhain. And then we ring a bell and we honor those who've departed, whether they're human or animals. So look for more information about that Samhain ritual. We're going to have the invitation is probably going to be up tomorrow. You'll be able to get a ticket for as little as $1 donation. And for those who are in our Shadow Seekers membership, your ticket already comes with your membership. Okay, so just look for the invitation though, and you'll get more information about that. And again, that is Saturday, November 4th. That is going to be, I think it's around 4:30 p.m. Pacific. So it would be 7:30 p.m. Eastern. For anybody who gets a ticket, there is a replay of the ritual that you will get access to, so you don't have to worry if you can't be there at that time live. And then the following week on 11/8, I'm going to be back talking about the chakras, and we're moving up the system into the heart chakra. That's the bridge between the lower chakras and the upper chakras. Some say that is the bridge between the physical and the spiritual. And then I also want to announce that on 11/22, this is Wednesday 11/22, instead of having a Ask Aislin episode like this on Facebook Live, we're actually going to have a live Zoom class that people can come to. This is my Introduction to Shadow Work workshop. If you've never been to it before, you don't want to miss this workshop. If you like shadow work, it's a free workshop. Or if you are, interested in learning about shadow work, it's a free workshop. For those who've already taken it before, I change it every time. I change it a little bit, so you always learn something new, and it's always good to kind of reorient yourself with all the information. So look for that, and immediately after that workshop, our Shadow Seekers membership will be open, taking in new members for about the next week. We have a very, very special offer that we are going to be offering this Thanksgiving. And so this Black Friday, I have the feeling that those who have been on the fence about joining our membership, this is probably going to be the time you're going to want to join it. Okay, so more news will be coming on that soon. All right, so if there are no more comments here, then I am going to sign off. But if I missed anybody's questions, I will go back later and I will answer those. And if you're watching the replay, feel free to put the questions in too. I'll answer those afterwards as well. All right, until next time, blessed be.